Welcome to Life Stories. Imagine being invisible to the world, ignored, overlooked, and judged before you even speak. That was Elijah's reality every day on the streets of New York City. But in one fateful moment, everything changed. When the FBI director, Madeleine Carter, found herself in a life-or-death situation, Elijah didn't hesitate. He acted with courage, saving her life. Yet instead of praise, he faced cruel judgment. What happened next shocked everyone. Stay with us as we dive into this powerful story of bravery, prejudice, and redemption. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. The streets of Chicago were not kind to a boy like Elijah. At just 11 years old, he had seen more than most adults ever would. His days were a constant battle for survival, searching through trash bins for something to eat, finding shelter where he could, and staying out of trouble. The cold pavement beneath his worn-out shoes felt like home. Though he longed for something more, Elijah was no stranger to hunger. It gnawed at him in the early mornings and settled like a dull ache in his stomach throughout the day. His clothes, once new, were now thin and frayed at the seams, barely enough to keep the wind from biting at his skin. His shoes, held together by sheer will and tattered laces, had long lost their purpose of keeping his feet dry. He moved through the city streets with quiet determination, his dark brown eyes scanning every face that passed by, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that someone would truly see him. But people rarely did. Most walked past him as if he were a ghost, an unseen part of the city's backdrop. Others averted their eyes, pretending not to notice. A few spared a glance, but their expressions were always the same: pity, discomfort, or worse, suspicion. Elijah had learned early that people didn't like being reminded of things they didn't want to see. A homeless black boy was one of those things. Still, he carried hope inside him, tucked away like a secret, refusing to let the world strip him of it. He had seen others give up, their spirits crushed under the weight of indifference. But Elijah was different. He believed, against all odds, that there was something better waiting for him. The city, however, had its own way of testing people like him. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows between towering buildings, Elijah sat at the corner of a busy intersection. He watched the world move without him. The sharp click of heels, the distant hum of car horns, and the rhythmic beeping of crosswalk signals blending into a kind of symphony, a song of lives more important than his. Or so it seemed. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger had become a familiar companion. Instead, he focused on the people around him, studying their faces, their hurried steps, their eyes filled with thoughts of anything but the boy sitting alone on the sidewalk. Elijah wasn't asking for much. He never did. He wasn't the type to beg, though he knew how. He had learned, in his short years, that dignity was one of the few things he could still hold on to. Then, just as he was about to move on, something caught his attention. A woman, moving through the crowd with the kind of presence that turned heads. Madeleine Carter. He didn't know her name then, but he could tell she was important. There was a confidence in the way she walked, her shoulders squared, her eyes set forward with determination. The people around her parted slightly, instinctively making space for her as if they recognized her authority. Her suit was immaculate, her hair neatly pulled back, and the way her colleagues flanked her only reinforced her position. Elijah had seen many powerful people in passing: politicians, businessmen, wealthy socialites. They all carried themselves the same way, as if they owned the space around them. But there was something different about Madeleine. For a fleeting second, she turned her head ever so slightly in his direction. And then, just as quickly, she was gone. Elijah exhaled, shaking off the moment. He had seen enough people come and go to know that none of them ever stayed. They lived in a different world, a world where children like him didn't exist. But what he didn't know then was that fate had already begun weaving their stories together. That soon. In the heart of that cold, indifferent city, their lives would collide in a way neither of them could have imagined. The evening air in New York City was crisp. The streets alive with the usual rush of people heading home, out to dinner, or lost in their own thoughts. Elijah had wandered through the city many times before, watching its rhythm, memorizing its pulse. He had learned that if you paid close enough attention, you could read the city like a book, its patterns, its shifts, the way people moved. Tonight was no different. At least at first. He had just stopped near a busy intersection when he noticed Madeline Carter again. Even in a city filled with important people, she stood out. The way she carried herself. The way people around her whispered her name. The quiet authority she exuded, it all told Elijah that she was someone who mattered. He wasn't sure why, but he watched her for a moment, his instincts telling him to pay attention. Then it happened. At first, it was just a small hitch in her step. She reached for her throat, her fingers trembling. A cough. Then another. The confident, composed woman who had been walking through the streets like she owned them suddenly staggered, her face tightening with pain. No one noticed. Her colleagues walked ahead, too deep in conversation to realize something was wrong. The people around her barely glanced, lost in their own distractions. But Elijah saw everything. Her face reddened. Her body convulsed slightly as she struggled for air. Panic flashed in her eyes. She was choking. Elijah didn't hesitate. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. He pushed through the crowd, slipping between people too stunned to react. He had seen people choke before. In shelters. In alleys. Even on the streets. He knew the look of someone on the verge of losing control. Madeline's hands clutched her throat, her breaths coming in desperate, shallow gasps. Her knees buckled slightly, and she swayed, her usually sharp presence unraveling into something vulnerable. No one was helping her. Elijah reached her just in time. He had never performed the Heimlich maneuver before. Not in real life. But he had seen it done. He had watched enough people take action in emergencies to understand what had to be done. His arms wrapped around her from behind, his small but strong hands pressing against her abdomen. He pushed once. Nothing. Madeline's body trembled, her eyes wide with terror. Elijah tightened his grip, planted his feet, and pushed harder. A second. A third. And then, a choking gasp, a violent cough. And finally, the piece of food dislodged, falling to the ground as Madeline doubled over, her body shaking with relief as she took in deep, desperate gulps of air. The world around them froze. The bustling crowd that had ignored her distress now stood in stunned silence. People whispered, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. Someone had saved the FBI director. And it wasn't one of her colleagues. It wasn't a doctor, a bodyguard, or a fellow official. It was Elijah. Elijah took a step back, his breathing heavy, his hands still trembling from the effort. His heart pounded. But it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something deeper, more unfamiliar. He had just saved a life. Not just any life, but the life of one of the most powerful people in the city. Madeline Carter straightened slowly, one hand still pressed against her chest as she worked to steady her breath. Her eyes, wide with shock, met Elijah's. There was gratitude in them, something raw and unguarded. For the first time in his life, someone important was truly looking at him, not through him, not past him, but at him. I can breathe, she gasped, still regaining control of her voice. She swallowed hard, struggling for words. You saved me. Elijah didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a sharp voice cut through the stunned silence. Why is he even touching her? The words hit him harder than he expected. Elijah turned, his chest tightening as he saw where the voice had come from, a woman. Arms crossed, Her lips twisted in disdain. She wasn't looking at him with awe or gratitude. She was looking at him like he was a problem. He had saved a life. And yet, a man in an expensive suit scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. Probably just looking for attention. Elijah's stomach twisted. He had heard those words before. He had felt those looks before. Suspicion. Judgment. Dismissal. They didn't see a boy who had acted in a moment of crisis. They saw a homeless black kid who had no business being near someone like Madeline Carter. Someone else muttered under their breath, "What does he know about saving lives?" Elijah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand still. He had been through worse. He knew how to survive cruelty. But this was different. This wasn't just being ignored. This was being erased after doing something good. He glanced at Madeline, waiting for her to say something, to stop them. But for a moment, she remained silent, her own shock keeping her still. The murmurs in the crowd grew. The gratitude he thought he would receive turned into something uglier. He had done something incredible, something no one else in that crowd had thought to do, and yet, all they could see was what he looked like. Elijah felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. He had always known how the world worked. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, people like them would never see him as anything more than an outsider. But then, just as he was about to turn away, Madeline Carter took a step forward. And when she finally spoke, her voice was like thunder cracking through the night. The world had changed for Elijah in ways he never could have imagined. After Madeline Carter silenced the crowd with her powerful words, something shifted not just in the people watching, but in Elijah himself. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting to survive. He was being seen. Truly seen. News of what happened spread quickly. By the next morning, headlines across the city spoke of a homeless boy who had saved the FBI director's life. But it wasn't just about the rescue, it was about the injustice that followed. People who had ignored kids like Elijah before were now forced to confront their own biases. Madeline didn't just thank him with words. She took action. She made sure Elijah had access to food, shelter, and education. But more than that, she gave him something no one else had before, an opportunity to dream. Elijah's life didn't change overnight. He still had challenges ahead. But for the first time, he had something he never had before, a future. As he stood in front of the city skyline, watching the sun set over the place he had once called home, he felt something unfamiliar, hope. He had been invisible for so long. But now the world knew his name. And more importantly, he knew his own worth. Because a hero isn't defined by where they come from, but by what they choose to do when the moment comes. If you found this story inspiring, subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible real-life tales. Stay tuned for the next one, you won't want to miss it.